Okay. Let me see, is there any business? Oh, yeah, okay, a little bit of business to begin with. First of all, if you have not done so already, no pressure. It's rather early in the day. But you have a peer review on turnitin.com. You're peer reviewing the last homework assignment we turned in, the thesis body paragraph thing. So you go to Turnitin, click on the assignment. It will randomly give you a classmate's homework. And then I think I gave you like maybe 5 or so questions to answer on it. So it will not take you a lot of time, okay? But the reason we have you do peer review, one, to try to help each other out. That's always nice. I think that's something we should do. But number 2, honestly, the big reason you peer review is to help you. It's much easier to critique someone else's work than it is your own, to like see problems. But you're trying to exercise those muscles so that you can take that to your work. And it's easier to root stuff out. So I want you to take the assignment seriously. Now that said, I believe the way Turnitin works for peer review assignments is it won't give you a paper to review unless you've submitted one. So if you did not turn in the homework for Saturday, I don't think you'll be able to get one for peer review. I think that's how it works. Yes, sir?
What's the class code? 'Cause I couldn't find it.
It's in an email that I sent. I don't know off the top of my head. If, go and look in your inbox if you still can't, like if you search for Turnitin, one word, info, it'll probably come up. Look for that, and if you can't find it, email me, I'll send it to you again.
Okay.
But yeah, it's our class ID is a string of numbers, and then the password is man stuff, capitalized one word. Anyway, that's the Turnitin stuff. Also at the end of the week, Saturday, you have a rough draft due. That's also on turnitin.com. Okay. So what we're going to do today, we have a rough draft due. Obviously, that means we have a paper coming up. What I want to do, we've talked about body paragraphs somewhat extensively. Today, I want to concentrate on introductions, okay? So ideally, by the end of today, you will have all of the sort of requisite parts to write a paper in the way that we're thinking about. To begin with, I want to talk about the parts of an introduction. You guys know some of these. Usually you know about 2 of them. What are the parts of an introduction? Like you have to have these in an introductory paragraph in one of these papers.
Thesis?
Yeah. Gotta have a thesis. And we're gonna get all these up here and then we'll talk about them. Okay. What else?
A hook?
Yeah, that's the other one you guys always know. Okay. Can anybody think of any others?
Claim?
That should be your thesis. Your thesis should be a claim, should be an argument, yeah. Okay. The other 2, and by the way, there's different ways to talk about these parts, okay? I call them what I call them, but introductions generally all work the same, okay? You need to introduce the text, and you need what I call the roadmap, and we're going to talk about that. All right, so working our way through them. To begin with, I have a question mark after hook because the hook is optional, okay? You guys love having them, and by all means, do it, but you do not have to have a hook, okay? What is a hook? Why do we call it that?
It's an attention grabber.
Yeah, you hook the reader, like the example I love to give, Dave Chappelle, like, gotcha, bitch. I don't know if you guys know, it's an old skit. But it's like that, like, oh, well, I'm coming with you now, right? That's why we call it a hook. Do you guys know any sort of popular mechanisms for that? Like, there's a couple generally that we like to use.
Quotes and questions.
You can use a quotation that has some. All of these, by the way, any hook you use should have something to do with your paper, right? Like something to do with your argument. Some kind of quotation that you kind of work in that's interesting in some way. Yeah. We talk a lot about masculinity. A really famous one, Theodore Roosevelt once said, I could carve I could carve a better man out of a banana. Talking about somebody he thought was not manly enough. Think about that. You said questions. Importantly, Usually, we mean rhetorical questions. Does anyone know what a rhetorical question is?
The question does require an answer.
Good. The example I love to give for this. If your mother ever says something to the effect of, "Did I ask for your opinion?" What are you supposed to say?
No.
You say nothing. I mean, you could say no. That's about all you could say, but mostly you say nothing. That's a rhetorical question. She is not telling you to shut up, but she is indicating that with a question, right? She's kind of putting that thought in your mind without saying it. That's how rhetorical questions work. Those are two popular ones. Others would be like a fun fact. I can't think of any like manly facts. I'm sure there are some. There's always the one, men die earlier. That's a fun one. Start your paper with, did you know? If you happen to be a man reading this paper, you will die earlier. Read fast. But anyway, or it could be an anecdote. Anecdotes are hard, especially for a paper of this length. This is only 3 pages. So you want to get to your argument kind of quickly. Anecdotes tend to take time. So you probably avoid those, at least for this paper. Does anybody know what an anecdote is? I just realized I might have to.
It's a short story.
A story, a very short story. Yes. Okay. So that's how hooks work. You don't have to have them, but you guys love them. That's how they work. They're right up top. The next 3 parts of an introduction you do have to have, okay? These are required. Introduce the text. That is where you introduce the text. Title and author. In B.H. Fairchild's Body and Soul, if you're writing about that one, right? I know who wrote it. I know the name of the poem. I know what we're looking at right from the jump, okay? What tends to happen if you do not introduce the text? 97% of the time, this happens. If somebody does not introduce the text from the very top, usually you will talk about ideas related to the text, but they're going to be outside of the poem itself. A lot of the time, weirdly, when people do this, they write a paper about their dad. And that doesn't go well. That's not the assignment, just so we're clear. But that's what happens, because your brain, we're all associative creatures. So you might have thoughts about the poem, but if you don't force yourself, that's what this does. If you don't force yourself to talk about it from the start, your brain will go any number of ways. Again, that are related, but that's not what we're doing. We're not talking about related things. We're talking about the poem. So help yourself out. Introduce the text from the beginning. We're going to skip roadmap for just a second because it ties into the thesis. What is a thesis? I feel like you guys know this one.
The point that you're trying to write in the paper, like what you're trying to prove, I guess.
Good. So it does 2 things. It's the main idea of your paper, and ideally, your paper is argumentative, which means your thesis should be an argument, should be a claim, like we said earlier. Other characteristics of a thesis, traditionally, it's a thesis statement, so it's like, it's not short, but it's not long either. 2 to 3 sentences, we would say, something like that in a paper of this size, It doesn't have to be a single sentence. I know some of you, that's like blasphemy, but 2 to 3 sentences, something like that. The reason that is, the thesis statement, as we said, is your main idea. It's meant to be something that I can kind of pick up and take with me as a reader. Like, I know this is your main idea, your overall goal in writing the paper, but it's compact enough for me to kind of keep in my head as I read the rest of your work, right? And as you're proving smaller parts of that, I'm like, oh, okay, yeah, that makes sense. I see how that helps prove their main idea, right? That's why theses are built that way. The trouble with that is that when you have a thing that's supposed to be the main idea of your whole paper, right? I'm going to prove this in 3 pages, but it's going to be about this long, is that it gets very compact. You have big ideas that you're kind of shoving into a very small space. That can be tricky. The roadmap is your opportunity to explain in a little more detail how those ideas work, okay? So you're going to give me any explanations, any details I'm going to need to understand your thesis before I get there. You're going to set me up to kind of be on your side. And then when I get here, I'm like, oh yeah, that's what they were, I see where they were headed now in the roadmap. Make sense? Okay. The other thing the roadmap can do, the reason I call it a roadmap, it can, especially, again, in a paper of this size, help guide your paper. If your thesis is meant to be your main idea, right, and your roadmap is meant to set up your thesis, explain your thesis in detail, well then chances are very good that your body paragraphs are going to in some way reflect the contents of that roadmap, right? Put that another way that might be a little easier to understand. In a paper of this size, 3 pages, you have an introduction, you have a conclusion. How many body paragraphs do you think you're going to have?
Probably like somewhere to like 3 to 5
5 would be a lot.
for a 3-page paper.
Yeah. Introduction would be about the first page, right? Because you get all the headers and whatnot. It'd be about the first page. Conclusion isn't a lot, but yeah, 3 paragraphs, at most 4. I wouldn't think more than that, but somewhere like that, okay? If you provide at least 1 sentence for each body paragraph in your roadmap, not only are you going to, hopefully, better explain your thesis, but you're also going to help me understand what I'm going to see in the rest of your paper. You're going to set me up for that too, right? Now we're going to have some fun. I mean that in a relative way. We're going to try to write an introduction together. All right. Before we do that, a couple things. Number one, I really hope you watched the video from Monday's class. Today's going to be harder if you didn't. I shouldn't have to say this next part. I also hope you read the poem. That will also make things a struggle, but we'll see what happens. So what we talked about on Monday, I used the royal we. I know you guys weren't here. We talked about beauty, the poem. And there's all kinds of things going on in this poem. It's the longest one we read, right? There's different themes that you could explore. But the one we lit upon, I would argue, and I think most of you would agree, is really the one that kind of guides the whole thing, right? And that is this sort of dichotomy in the poem. Do you mind know what dichotomy means? Don't worry about it. Dichotomy, two sides, okay? Basically 2 binary sides. You're either this or you're this. That's a dichotomy, okay? There seems to be one in the poem in a lot of different ways, with this hard line between the 2. So for instance, when Uncle Ross tells the speaker's mom that the centerpiece is lovely, right? And the father is so offended he has to get up and leave the room. That's an illustration of that dichotomy. Uncle Ross is over here with lovely and California, being able to talk about beauty. People wonder if people on this side might be homosexual. All that's on this side, right? On the other side, you have somebody like the speaker's dad, who can talk about beauty, but only when it's a new pickup or a dead deer. Bobby Sudduth, if you remember that guy, he talks about Oswald blowing JFK's head off. He calls that shot a beauty. So they can talk about it too, but it's a very different kind of beauty, right? They talk about hard, true labor, blue-collar work. They're very interested in physicality. Bobby's very interested in sex. All these things seem to get on this, seem to be lumped together on this side, right? And so much of the poem, all these different episodes, seem to be concerned with what a man can and can't do, what a man is expected to be, questions like this. So this is the kind of chart that we came up with on Monday. And there's that line, okay? I put this up here to help us. We may not need it, but it's there for us if we do. Okay. Now to begin with, if you're going to sit down and write an introduction, first thing I would tell you. If you want to write a hook, if you want to have a hook to your paper, do it. That's awesome. I would love to be interested to read your paper. However, if you cannot light upon some kind of a hook rather quickly, skip it. Come back to it later if you want, but skip it for now. Now put it to you like this. How many times in your lives, short though they've been thus far, have you tried really hard to be interesting and it worked out well? Did it go well when you tried real hard to be interesting? Well, you're in the minority on that, boss. It usually doesn't go well. When you try really hard, when you sit there and like, how could I like really sell this guy on this? It's not going to work. You're going to write a hook and it's going to be terrible. That's how it's going to go. The thing I'm actually worried about, I don't so much mind a bad hook. What I'm actually worried about is you're going to spend an inordinate amount of time just sitting here looking at your cursor, blinking, trying to think of something interesting to say.
I like that.
Do what?
I hate that.
That's awful. There's different extensions you can get to where it makes the cursor stop blinking, or it makes it go away entirely.
I like to do that.
Some people are tortured by this.
Yeah.
I took a lot of writing classes. The blinking cursor is a real thing. Yeah, it fucks with some people. But that aside, get rid of it immediately. So we skip the hook if we can't think of something, and maybe we can. It's covered up now, but we can move to the next section. What was that? What do we need to do? Good. So we're talking about beauty. How might we introduce that text? What information do we need? What? Oh, good. Yes. Super easy way to do that. What's the author's name?
B.H. Fairchild.
Thank you. And B.H. Fairchild's, if I could type. So immediately, we know what text we're looking at, right? We have who wrote it and what it is. So as a reader, I'm with you. Fun story about B.H. Fairchild, very quickly. When his father went away to World War II, his mother was pregnant with old B.H. B.H. stands for Bertram. Very old name, right? When his dad went away, they're like, oh, what do you want to name your son? You know, blah, blah, blah. We were thinking Bertram. He's like, I want to call him Pete. They're like, no, we're not doing that. We're going to call him Bertram. So when his dad was away, they named him Bertram. When his dad got back from World War II, they're like, you didn't name him Pete? No, we weren't Bertram. Well, I'm going to call him Pete. So if you run into B.H. Fairchild, which is still a very real thing, he's kicking around, he goes by Pete. Because his dad called him that his whole life. Never called him Bertram. He's like, I'm going to call him what I want to. His name's Pete. That's a fun story. I don't know. Could be a hook. All right. In B.H. Fairchild's Beauty, the next thing we have to do, the next part of introducing the text, is a bit of summary. Okay? 1 to 2 sentences probably max. If you were going to summarize this poem to someone, what would you say? What information would they need, do you think?
They can't say the word beauty.
Who can?
The people inside the dome.
Is it all the people? Who can't say the word beauty?
They.
Good. That's an important distinction, right? And B.H. Fairchild's Beauty. Wait, what just happened? Oh. What is wrong with me? Most of the time, okay? We go through all these different episodes where men either say it or don't, but it does seem like a lot of the time they're different expressions of places and times where men couldn't say this word, right? Okay. And you know it's important because it's the title. Any other information we might need? Because this is a longer poem too. So at the very least, I would say 2 sentences couldn't hurt, right? A little more summary. What else might we need to know if we're going to talk about this poem, do you think? Can't say the word. What else happens, or what else, again, if you're going to tell a buddy about this poem, they're like, hey, what poem you reading? I'm really into poems. You know, we all have those friends. They like poems. What would you tell them? Men can't say the word, and what else? Maybe something about the world these people are from, or the kind of people they are, or why the speaker is worried about them being able to say beauty, any of that stuff.
You can talk about how this is from outside looking inside of the own.
What do you mean by that?
Like, is the person's listening at this place?
What person?
The speaker, is the speaker visiting? Well, not listening. Like, he's not used to.
Well, the speaker's from there. Okay, so if I follow you, like, the way this poem is delivered is the speaker is kind of looking back,
Yeah.
right? He's much older, so he grew up here, but then he like left or something, and we're getting his sort of opinion or his ideas about how he grew up from the outside, as you say.
Yeah.
Okay, yeah, we can talk about that. Importantly, I'm going to leave that open because there may be something more we want to say there, but that's good enough. So that's our summary. That's our introduction of the text. Title and author, and some important information. Now we got to do the roadmap, which is going to be tricky. Before we do that, I want to tell you a couple things. First of all, again, this is just a solid summary. If you had 2 sentences to summarize this poem to somebody who'd never read it, I think you could do a good deal worse than this, okay? Number 2, when you do that, chances are very good you're going to provide some significant details, right? So I'm trained enough, I've read enough of these, I've worked on enough papers to know when I'm reading this, I'm thinking as a reader, okay, obviously we're going to talk about why they can't say that word. That seems important. But also, this question of the speaker kind of being outside of the town and whatever that represents, right? That's our ammunition going forward, right? Like that is potentially likely to be something we're going to use for our argument, whatever it is. Okay. So to begin with the roadmap, I'm going to caveat the whole thing we're going to do today with this. We're rough drafting as a class. It's going to be ugly at times, okay? Like, not everything up here is going to be outstanding. It's going to be the same thing for you when you write on your own, okay? You have to be willing to, at some point in the process, go back, kind of ask yourself, is this working? Do I need to redo this? Do I need to delete this? Do I need to try something else? Those things are possible. We're not going to necessarily have time to do that in class. I just wanted to say that up front. But we'll see how we do. Now then, I mentioned before that the roadmap is meant to kind of explain your thesis, help set up your thesis. We don't have one of those yet. The other thing it's supposed to do is guide your paper. Help me know what I'm going to see when I get into your work. So, If you find yourself at this stage and you have little to no idea of what you actually want to argue, which is most of us, right? Okay. Go to moments in the text that you thought were interesting for one reason or another. You thought, man, that must mean something. There must be something else going on there, right? And if you can start talking about what you think those moments meant or why you think they're important, well, now you're on the road to an argument. You're starting to actually kind of unpack the text. We mentioned before, we're going to ballpark this paper around 3 body paragraphs, right? So as a class, we're going to try to write at least 3 sentences for this roadmap. So that means we need 3 moments from the poem. Okay? I'm going to give you the first one. But then you guys got to figure out the other 2. All right, to me, we're talking about not being able to say beauty. We're talking about reflecting upon it later. That's kind of our position to begin with. I feel like, and I may end up doing this with every class just because it is kind of perfect for where you guys are coming at it from. Let's talk about Uncle Ross. Who's Uncle Ross? Who remembers that guy? We get to learn a little bit about him. What does he do in this poem?
He's the one who says the centerpiece is lovely.
Calls the centerpiece lovely. The father is offended. The father leaves the room. What'd you say? Oh, okay. He tap dances, which is apparently an issue. We learned one other thing about him.
He's from California.
He's from California, which again, that comes up several times in the poem. Always seems to be a problem. Okay. So Uncle Ross is this character who, I mean, our first sentence says you can't say that word. Now he says lovely, which of course is a synonym. But it seems close enough. So he basically says beauty, and we see what happens when you do that in this place. So what? What's one thing we could say about that scene? What's an argument we could start to make, do you think?
That this Uncle Ross isn't really respected. Well, I don't say respect. He's not respected. He's not the favorite in the family.
Sure. I mean, that seems to be a given. Well, I'll put it to you this way. It's always helpful to try to ask like how or why questions. So one why question might be, why does Ross say lovely? Why does he do that? Our first sentence says he can't. So why does he? Do you think? What about Uncle Ross? Maybe you could argue enables him to say it, leads him to say it.
Maybe he's gay.
Do what?
Maybe he's gay.
I mean, the speaker would think so. Why do you say that?
Because he's not like a man's man. You can say you can find something creative.
Why?
I don't know, maybe things are more free in California.
Okay. Those maybes lead you into the realm of an argument, okay? You're saying maybe because you're like, I would have to figure out whether or not that's true, right? So let's talk about that some. For the people in this poem, for the people in this town, in Kansas, I know Kansas is a state, but I assume they all live in the same town. It seems like they have a similar opinion of Uncle Ross, right? And some of that might come down to his sexuality that I'm sure they have assumptions about. But we don't ever really hear about that, right? At least insofar as Ross is concerned. But we do hear about California, right? We say, when we talk about Ross, I could probably find it really quickly. One time, my Uncle Ross from California called the centerpiece lovely. Then his father leaves the room, clearly troubled by the word lovely, coupled probably with the very idea of California and the fact that he could tap dance, is what the poem says. So the speaker says he doesn't like that word, and we know that, but also he doesn't like the very idea of California. Now, we talked about this when we talked about Little Boy. Yeah, Little Boy. One thing that poem's about is the idea of America, right? Not like where we're standing or sitting in this moment, right? But the idea of America. That poem is kind of thinking about whether or not that's true. So the idea of California in this poem for these guys isn't necessarily the real California, right? That's not what we're talking about. We're talking about what it represents to these people in Kansas. One thing it represents is it's a place where men tap dance and say lovely. What does that mean, do you think? That Ross can say lovely?
I know, like I was like watching movies and stuff like growing up, and they'd be
Yeah.
like San Francisco, like was like the place where like a lot of people had like that was one of the places where they had gay clubs and stuff like that.
There was a bit of a boom
So
there,
it's
yeah.
like, I guess just to bring it up as like a historical thing, like.
Sure.
But so like maybe I'm thinking like maybe he just thinks based on whatever time period this poem was that he's like, oh, he's in the place where they're doing all that.
I mean, that's part of it, and that's part of kind of the narrative. But I think, I don't necessarily know in this scene if we're, again, because it'd be difficult, if not impossible, to speak to with what we have. I don't know that we're talking about sexuality here. I think it can be lumped in a way because what we're talking about, again, is this narrative about California, right? When I say the idea of California, it's like the story these people in Kansas have for it. So that might be part of it, but I think it's a little broader than that. Like, for instance, another question I could ask, other than some historical elements, and to be fair, that didn't really get into full swing until the 70s, which is after this poem. We still have this today. Like, what is the narrative around California? Like, what is the sort of idea of California that people have? Free? In what way?
Like, I don't know. See, now you're asking questions on it.
Well, because I think a lot of us, that's one of the first words that would sort of come to mind, right? They're freer out there, whatever that means. If you can't quite answer the next question, that's fine. We can bring it back to the poem. Uncle Ross is from California. He's freer in what important ways that the speaker's father might not like?
Maybe it's worship.
I mean, again, that's not the poem.
And like masculinity ways, like he's not really confined by the masculinity things that they have to do.
The sort of standards. Good. Yeah. Maybe. That's a fucking argument, by the way. Right? We would have to speak to that. Let's do that. Okay. I'm going to have one more question for you. You're not off the hook, but... all right. This is the ugly part of drafting, like I mentioned. So, Uncle Ross offends the speaker's father by noting the loveliness of her centerpiece because, can you say kind of what you said one more time? I want to try to get it right.
In California, they don't have
You don't have to get it verbatim, just like, give us your idea again if you could.
Kind of like, because he's in California, he doesn't have to conform to the masculinity standards that they have to in Kansas.
They're not held to those same ideas like they are in Kansas. That's part of that narrative, right? They're freer, you know? It's like, well, what kinds of stuff are they free from? They don't have any rules out there. They're crazy. Sure. Okay, so speaker's father knows the Holy Spirit because as a Now that is a long, ugly sentence, and we would clean that up in post, okay? But that's an argument. Pretty interesting too, right? Like, to boil that all down, basically what we're saying is, because Uncle Ross, not just because he's from California, but because he represents it, right? He brings those associations with him when he comes to this town. For a guy like Speaker's father, he's already assuming that narrative. Look how free that fucking guy is. Then he says loving, he's like, I knew it. I knew he wasn't held, we're going to argue, potentially, to these same standards, right? And it's all because of what I'm thinking about him in California. Yeah, sure. That's the first part of our roadmap. Look at that. We can do this. Now, we need two more moments or episodes or interesting, just like elements from the poem, okay? And what we've talked about thus far. They can't say beauty, the men can't. And we have this idea that the speaker kind of knows that now because he's an outsider now in some way, okay? That's kind of where we're coming at it from. Our first point was that Uncle Ross is also an outsider, so he can say it, and we talk a little bit about why that is. Are there any other moments in the poem we could also think about that might tie into that stuff somehow? There's one big one, for instance. Pretty important in the poem. Think about California.
When the people in the black Corvette.
The exhibitionists. They're from California, right?
Yes.
So they're for these guys, basically just like Uncle Ross, right?
They're just more open.
They're just what? I didn't hear you.
They're just more open.
Clearly, right? They show up and take all their clothes off. That is the definition of free. For anybody keeping score at home. Okay. I'll set up the sentence again so we can talk about it. All right. So if anyone doesn't quite remember what happens with the exhibitionist, let's give a quick rundown. How does that go in the poem? Two guys show up to work at the machine shop. The speaker's father, who's the foreman, takes them on, right, because they need the help. But then what happens? What do the exhibitionists do?
Do they just get naked in the middle of the shop?
Yeah. Exactly. Okay. So what? Like, we can think about a couple things. Number one, what else happens? And if you want me here, I could help you find that scene real quick. It's in part 2. Oh, wait, no. Sorry, it's in part 3. It's about halfway down that really long stanza. I think part 3 is just one long stanza. You can think about how we talk about the scene, like there's all kinds of interesting language in here. Or you can think about like things that happen, as a result of what these guys do. I'll give you a second to look it over. You're just looking for alarm bells now.
The whole shop goes silent.
The whole shop went silent. Yeah,
Bobby was gonna beat them up,
that's a good one too.
but his dad saved them.
And that's weird, isn't it? The speaker's father, not just that he has to save them, which is telling, but that he does, right? He steps in. That kind of shows us something about him, right?
From the first one, I didn't think he would.
Sure. He's so offended by that word, he has to leave the room, right? Bobby is so offended that he's going to have them leave the earth, right? But yeah, the speaker's father steps in. That's interesting. Now, real quick, we're at a point in the kind of argument we're beginning to make about this part of the poem. We could go many different ways. It seems like we're going to do this one, which is fine. What you highlighted, or began to, is a totally other direction. When I mentioned there's a lot of language in the poem, the shop does go silent. The speaker compares the men, like the workers around the exhibitionists, to children at the zoo or at a first snow. Like there's wonder in their eyes. They don't know how to react. That's a whole other thing that we will not have time to talk about both. But you could absolutely take this in a different direction with that stuff, okay? So it also depends, the point I'm making, it depends what you focus on, what you're going to actually talk about. But we could do Bobby and the speaker's father. The exhibitionists, who also come from California, all right, so what I just had to do there is something you may have to do, which is I had to write a whole lot to realize I don't need most of that. Because I thought we were going to talk about the exhibitionist, but as it turns out, we're really talking about this, right? Okay. All right. Initially, this will seem like an easy question. Why does the speaker's father save the exhibitionists? I thought it was an easy question.
Well, he doesn't want anybody to get like beat up and
Murdered? Doesn't want people to get fucking murdered in the middle of the machine shop? Sure. Okay, that's what I was hoping is like the easy response. Okay. Which is to say, we're not going to argue that, right? The speaker's father saves these guys because he doesn't want them beaten to death with a metal rod. Like, that's what's going to happen, right? But again, we know that. We assume that. Okay. Keep in mind what we just said. Like you pointed out a couple minutes ago, he was so offended by the word lovely, he left the room. Clearly, he does not appreciate these guys getting naked in the shop, right? Clearly, he would be offended by that. He would be troubled by that. And he does tell them to leave, okay? But his response is not Bobby's response. And that seems like that's kind of what we've lit upon, right? Why do you think he responds differently from Bobby? Let's start there. This can be about Bobby or it can be about the speaker's father, basically, is what we're doing right now.
Bobby always does crazy stuff anyway.
Okay, he does.
He's known for just doing, like, I can't even explain the stuff that he does.
Sure. Well, again, for those keeping score at home, and then I think you started to say something. The other things we know about Bobby, eventually he kills himself. You find that out toward the end of the poem in a super brutal fashion. But also, when we meet Bobby, we get his sexual autobiography, right?
Sister.
He had sex with his sister,
That's
and you're not a man if you don't have STD. Yeah. So yeah, Bobby is more extreme. We can say that pretty easily. Sure. But more extreme in what way? That might be part of what we need to figure out. What is he more of? Or what does he take further?
his actions are more further.
Sure.
The father is just more like the father is more like a judgmental person, but Bobby's like, does.
I mean, Bobby makes a judgment,
Yeah,
but his sentencing is harsher. Okay.
I feel like he's trying to prove that he's more of a man sexually.
Okay. Well, so you're saying that initial episode with the autobiography? Sure. Are you saying he's also trying to prove he's more of a man here?
Because I mean, the speaker says that he's looking at them with something other than anger, kind of like terror.
A terror, an animal wildness, he says. Yeah. Not just anger. So it is anger, but a kind of terror on his face, an animal wildness.
Like, why would he be afraid?
What are you feeling when you feel afraid? What does an animal feel when it feels afraid? Helpless? What did you say? Did you say afraid? I was like, don't do that. What did you say? Threatened. Good. Say it with your chest, man. Yeah, I think Bobby feels threatened. I think we could say that. No. Those are the reason you guys have those arguments is because they're cliche. So you got to watch out for those. We got nothing in the poem that really helps us with that. You could maybe make the case, but like there's nothing in the poem. That's not. And it's honestly, it's not important. It doesn't matter if he's gay. It doesn't matter if he's into trees. It doesn't matter. Right? Why? Why does he? Why does he feel threatened? I think it's more basic than his like maybe not sexuality. Why does he feel threatened? By the appearance of two naked men. That's it. That's all we're really saying. What's threatening about that, do you think? To a guy like Bobby?
Threatening his manhood.
Okay. How so?
Because I guess their social norms, like, I don't know. I think the only way that I can think about it is like I saw this video like these guys at the barbershop getting a haircut. It was naked. It was weird. And I was
They
like,
were
why-
naked?
Yeah, I was like, why is that happening?
That would be
But,
so
like,
itchy.
And it's just weird. Like what? Like I don't know. Like I don't want to tell my girl I was at the barbershop and it was like not gay dudes, but like just a group of naked guys.
To be fair, I don't want to be around anyone naked at a...
Exactly. That's just weird.
Sure.
But like if it was like girls like at the strip club, because you know at the strip club they cut people's hair too. So it's
They
like,
do?
Yeah.
Again, it seems like a bad idea.
Yeah, but
But
they do. Like this,
Okay.
like there's a strip club. I think a new one that came out in Atlanta. My uncle was telling me about. It's like
Okay.
you can get a lineup, and then like it's like strippers like twerking and stuff around you, and then it's like, oh, that's cool. That's a man's place, but it's like
I do know what you're
I
saying.
wouldn't want anybody there.
I do know what you're saying. Okay. So, all right. By the way, again, we're working as a hive mind. So we're kind of in a way representing a brain, which is chaotic, right? It seemed like we were going to talk about the father, but Bobby, as he often does, has kind of taken the oxygen out of it. It seems like now we're talking about him, right? Damn it, we're going to have to change it again. All right. I know you basically said it, but we'll try to put it in a sentence now. The point you were making, I think, is one of the things you said was these guys, these two exhibitionists, threaten Bobby's manhood because they don't adhere to the standards or the assumptions that we have, right? Two men should not be naked in a machine shop if you're Bobby Souteth. If you're Bobby Souteth, two men should not be naked together really ever. And the best part of that is to kind of give you some more leverage with that argument. In this same scene, the speaker, who, as he points out throughout the poem, is kind of firmly on this side when he's a boy, right? When he's in these memories rather than having them. When he talks about the exhibitionists, he talks about how embarrassed they're going to be, like when they realize where they are. He says, this is not the locker room after the game. They were not taking a shower. This was not the appropriate place, right? He gives you the standards you're talking about, right? So absolutely, that's in play. Okay. So they threaten his manhood by not just not adhering to the standards, right? They're stronger than that by disregarding. Could you argue, this is a question, could you argue Uncle Ross disregards the standards, okay? But these guys, like, challenged them, you know? Because, like, their action is stronger. Do you see what I mean? All right. Yeah, whatever. All right. That's our second plank in our roadmap. Mixed metaphor, don't worry about it. Seems like there's plenty to talk about there, honestly. All right, let's get one more. One more moment or episode, one more element from this poem that we could think about. And again, the two we have right now, we have Uncle Ross sort of disregarding these gender expectations, okay? Then we have the exhibitionists challenging, like taking it even further, these expectations. What else could we think about? Maybe one more thing.
We could probably talk about how the speaker can say the word maybe.
Okay. Yeah, because like, as we pointed out right from the very top, he's an outsider now. He's in Italy, for God's sake, in a museum, looking at art and stuff. And he can say it. Cool. Let's start with the easy stuff first. Why can the speaker say it now, do you think? We learned a little bit about him. Why can he say it now? He couldn't then. But why now?
Like, because he left that macho world behind. Like, you don't gotta...
So when he left that town, he left kind of what the town represented in a way?
Right.
Okay. That still doesn't necessarily tell us why he changed. Do you know what I mean? Like, to borrow some of our logic from earlier, the two groups of folks from California seem to like bring California with them in a way. So why doesn't he keep Kansas with him? Like, what changes for this guy? Or
Experience.
okay, maybe
He's married now.
he's married, but people in Kansas are married, right? They're all married. What else? We don't know a lot about the speaker, right? That's a double-edged sword. On the one hand, it makes it kind of tough. On the other hand, we're running out of options. You guys have given us a couple, and they're all true. What else do we know about the speaker? It's not a lot. We really only hear about him at the beginning and at the end, I think. else do we know of? I can only think of one other thing you guys haven't mentioned. And it's kind of fun for me because I think you guys take this for granted. Where are they at?
Just,
Mm-mm. Where's the speaker?
He was in Italy, right?
He's in Italy,
Yeah.
which is not Kansas. And I don't just mean that in the stupid way that we all understand. But again, if part of this poem seems to be concerned with stereotypical assumptions, which is pretty clear. But now it's not just gender, right? Now we're thinking about stereotypes we have about places. When I say Kansas, we all have a certain kind of an idea. Same thing with California. Same thing with Italy, I think. I have never been to two of the places I just named, but I feel like I know about them. Right? What is Italy in this poem, do you think? And he never calls it Italy, by the way. He says Florence. Talks about the Bargello, right? What does Italy represent in this poem?
I feel like to them it's like some like fancy place overseas.
Sure. Define fancy. There's different kinds of fancy.
Like, what's the word? I can't find an adjective to
Okay.
describe it. I guess like something more like posh.
Okay. Yeah, okay, so kind of ritzy, kind of artsy,
Yeah.
maybe? I mean, again, they are in a museum, right? Okay. So, one of the things we know about the speaker is he's now in Italy, so he's not just not in Kansas. You can think about maybe where he is now. That may be somehow representative of where he's sort of gone to, where he's moved internally or whatever, right? And that place has these associations about it. It's kind of artsy, it's kind of fancy, right? Especially when you compare it to some place like Kansas. And now we're saying that mindset, the speaker's kind of taking that on. Is that fair to say? That's an argument. We'll start there. I'm having a hard time coming up with adjectives too now. Taking on the, look, don't put it this way, but that's what we're going to do for our purposes. The fancier, okay. Now the hard part. To recap, first of all, we have our introduction of the text, right? Okay. It's really those first two sentences, and I left the second sentence kind of cut off. We could say more there if we wanted to. They're testing the sirens today. We got an email about it. Super disruptive, though. And then the rest of this, from here on, is our roadmap. I'm going to try real hard to concentrate. Uncle Ross, we said, is representative of California in some way, so he is able to disregard these standards. The exhibitionists are also from California in some way, but they take it further, just like Bobby takes his thing further, and they challenge those standards. And then we say the speaker, in the end, leaves Kansas, goes further than California, right? He's in some other place entirely. He goes to Italy, and whatever that represents. And so he's an outsider now. He's not interested. Those standards no longer apply to him. So he doesn't even have to challenge them, you could argue. So what are we talking about in this poem? if we're gonna tie all those threads together somehow, right? Seems like one of them has got to be these standards. We would all see that, right? We keep coming back to stereotypical assumptions, primarily concerned with masculinity, what men are supposed to be like. We keep coming back to that. So that's got to be in our thesis. Okay. There's one other thing we keep coming back to, though. What is it? There's two sort of concepts we keep trying to put in a conversation with each other. Stereotypical assumptions about masculinity and one other thing. Some other kind of assumption, maybe.
That we've been making?
That every point we've made has dances around these two ideas.
I guess like foreign concepts, not necessarily foreign as far as Italy, but just foreign like outsider concepts.
Like what?
Like how like they talk about like Kansas compared to like California and Italy, and like how
Okay.
things are different based on like the masculinity from out there coming inward.
So we're talking about like regional identities almost, in a way, like in a particular way. In other words, people from Kansas are different from people from California, are different from people from Italy, right? Yeah. That's in all of these. So it seems like we're talking about that too, somehow. What we want to try to do here with like the last 10, 15 minutes of class is sort out what it is, what's one thing we might be trying to say about those two ideas together.
People not fitting in with the society.
Some notes about that. When you sit down to write a thesis, just like I told you at the top of class, when you sit down to write about anything, 90% of the time, you have no idea what you want to say, right? So you have to write the thing, you have to kind of figure it out. Right here, I think some of these are baller, to be quite honest with you. I honestly do. The very last sort of point we make about Italy, wild to me. That's spectacular, okay? When you go to write these body paragraphs, I'm not saying do this, by the way. We came up with this together. You do your own thing, right? Most of you won't even write about this poem. But when you do this part, and you go to write your body paragraphs, you'll have this idea in mind. I want to do this. And maybe you will when you write that paragraph, okay? But a lot of the time, you'll alter this in some way. You'll get more specific, or you'll think you wanted to say this when in fact, when you write the paragraph, it comes out a different way. You have to do your best to recognize that. It's usually going to happen near the end of every body paragraph, okay? The two things you do at that stage, you find that argument near the end of that body paragraph, you move it to the top of that body paragraph in a topic sentence, right? Got to do that. Then you go back to your introduction and you kind of say, well, is that what I said? Do I need to rephrase this? Do I need to delete stuff, rewrite stuff, whatever? That's going to be part of it, okay? Now, all of that is my way of saying this. Yes, sometimes people don't fit in. But we know that, right? That's what's called, I'm not trying to call you out, you just kind of offered it, and I'm sorry. But that's what's called a banal claim. B-A-N-A-L. You want to make arguments, but you don't want them to be banal, okay? Here's my illustration of a banal claim. A couple months ago, you teach your kids all kinds of things. We had to explain to my son not just to look both ways when you cross the street, but why, right? He's 4. He's an idiot. That's how it works. But if someone approached you, like when you leave this class, you're about to cross the street, you're like, hey man, you need to look both ways. They're like, yeah, I know. And like, hold on, I got like stats and stuff. You're like, I don't need your stats. I get it. Cars, they hurt. Like, it's a banal claim. It's not worth proving. It is an argument, but we understand it like almost immediately. So you got to watch for those, okay? However, one thing you can think about 90% of the time, your very first claim is going to be banal. That isn't always necessarily a bad thing. So let's try it. The reason I love all those thesis statements is that they allow for a banal claim, okay? Again, if you were just to argue, sometimes people don't fit in your paper, I would be like, yeah, we all know that. But by setting it up with although, you're saying, look, this is in the poem, this is true. However, comma, the next point I'm going to make is even truer. That next point forces you to go further, right? And so a lot of the time, that forces you into a better argument, one that's worth proving. So, I hate everyone. Oh my God. Although people don't fit in, sure. What are we really saying in this poem? We're talking about, again, these masculine standards, masculine stereotypes, if you like, and regional stereotypes. We're talking about both of those together. What could we be trying to say about in this poem, do you think? How do they affect people, or why do we have them, or why are we talking about them in the poem? You know, why are they important? These masculine stereotypes and these regional stereotypes. What do you think? Ross disregards them, the exhibitionists challenge them, and then the speaker seems to
Don't fuck with him.
do what?
He just doesn't acknowledge him.
Well, he acknowledges them. He talks about them the whole poem, right?
He just totally forgets about him.
That's
Not
how-
forgets, like, look, I can't explain it.
Yeah, well, he's able to cross to this other side, right? And he seems unbothered by it. I think we'd all agree with that. But we're kind of claiming in that last part of the roadmap that he's able to do that because he takes on the sort of Italian stereotype, right? So what's one thing we might be saying about stereotypes?
It's different wherever you go.
Push on that a little bit, because we know that, right? That's another banal claim. It's 2020. You've all been taught repeatedly the stereotypes are bad, and we all know why, okay? So we don't have to talk about it. We know that. But again, because we all know it, it's banal. It's not worth proving. And again, the poem does challenge the validity of those stereotypes. Makes them seem oftentimes ridiculous. I don't think anyone would dispute that either. But I'll put it to you this way. All that said, we just said a couple minutes ago, we started to argue that the speaker is able to step outside of these masculine stereotypes by adopting Italian ones. So what are we kind of saying about these stereotypical assumptions? We're saying you can get outside of them, but what else are we saying? Oh, come on, guys.
This argument's really complex.
It's not that bad. You guys are on the
I
doorstep.
feel like this might be a stretch, but
Try it.
by accepting the stereotypes, you change the meaning of masculinity.
I didn't quite follow you. I'm sorry.
It's okay. It's like where by accepting certain stereotypes based on that place,
Yeah.
you're changing the meaning of masculinity. Like in California, you can say things like lovely, you can tap dance and still be masculine.
They're different kinds of masculinity. Certainly. But would we also agree that there are also certain kinds of masculinity based upon regional stereotypes? Okay. So again, we're back to our original problem, which is the speaker in this poem seems to successfully step outside of those masculine stereotypes he grew up with, right? We'd all agree with that. But doesn't he also, in a way, just take on those Italian stereotypes? Maybe it's an Italian masculinity, if you like. So what are we saying about the function of stereotypes? What are we saying about how they work in society for us? You can step outside of stereotypes, right? But what?
You can't escape stereotypes ever.
You can't escape them completely. You're always going to be stereotyped in one way or another. Sure. That's a bummer. That's an argument. You might be able to prove it in the poem. I'm going to write it down before we forget, because you guys are chomping at the bit to get out of here. Much of the poem challenges the validity of stereotypes, but the speaker's journey something like that. You're always going to have people, in other words, assuming they know something about you based upon how you look or where you're from or whatever, right? We always have a set of stereotypes for all kinds of people. Oh, you're not super masculine in my Kansas way, but you're from California. I know who you are, right? Or, oh, you can say beauty now, Mr. Speaker Man. Okay. Look at you over there in Italy, doing all the Italy stuff. I know who you are. I can boil you down very easily. It takes this beautiful, unfortunately, takes this beautiful moment at the end of the poem. Like the end of this poem, when he looks out over Italy and just thinks about Kansas and how beautiful it always was. That's amazing. That's gorgeous. Our thesis says, look, that is nice, but the other side of what's going on with this guy is he's just under the weight of different assumptions. You can't get outside of it. Fun. All right. That's basically what you do. That's how you write an introduction. No matter what you write about, by the way. That's how it always works.